Hi, welcome to Studio 411. I'm your host, Larry Dasilva, and we thank you for joining us this day. And we have a terrific guest tonight. We have Susan Schoenberger, who is an author as well as a former journalist, probably current journalist if she chooses to be. And Susan has written a great book of fiction here called The Virtues of Oxygen, and we're going to spend the next hour talking about that, as well as her career over the last few years in the realm of writing fiction, and doing quite a nice job. Susan, thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Appreciate it. Where did the idea for the book come from?
This book, which is my second novel, really started when I read an obituary in the New York Times in 2009. So I was kind of still working on getting my first book published, but I hadn't gotten it published yet, and I was really trying to move on and work on something else, try not to think about getting the first one published. And I read this obituary about a woman who had lived for most of her life in an iron lung. She died in 2009, and I just thought that was incredibly remarkable that this person had really lived her whole life. I think she was initially put in the iron lung when she was about 11 years old and lived to the age of about 70. So I just really thought about her story, and I was so kind of intrigued by what kind of life that would be, to be sort of immobilized, and yet her brain was not affected. So I read her autobiography, which she had written, which was mentioned in the obit, and got even more intrigued because her story was just incredible. And I started thinking about what it would be like to create a character based on this woman's true life story. And that was sort of the initial piece that put the book together. That's some of what the oxygen refers to in the book, because this woman obviously couldn't be alive if she was not given oxygen.
Right.
So that's really where it started, and then I began to build that around that character, a small town in New York State where I grew up, not the actual town where I grew up, but a fictional town, and some other characters who were people who got to know this woman and became her caregivers, and were also dealing with their own issues around the recession and money problems and family problems, and
something we all deal with.
Yeah,
at one point or another.
exactly.
All common denominators,
Right.
most of us should understand. Just for the viewer's benefit, again, the iron lung Susan refers to, which, believe it or not, again, many people don't know because of the advances, was the iron lung was an apparatus, which I'm sure you probably could talk more about, that had to do with allowing a person who contracted polio, which was a viral infection, a disease that was prevalent throughout the world, certainly in this country, and I'll even share some stories of a personal friend of mine who is a survivor, if you want to call it, polio. But again, the iron lung was for the most severe cases where obviously they had lost the ability literally to breathe. And Dr. Jonas, Jonas, just like the Jonas Brothers, okay. Salk was a scientist, you can look that up, again was one of the people that is credited with discovering the vaccine for polio. So that's why in the mid-50s, people like all of us probably in this room and in the studio didn't have to worry about polio, and it's been pretty much eradicated in this country, except I understand in some of the lesser developed countries it's making a little bit of a resurgence. So enough with the history lecture, but just to give you an idea, because I know, I had heard the term iron lung, but I just didn't fully understand, what the reason for it. But in the case of the character Vivian that you write about, it's her lifeline. There is no other choice there.
Right.
In preparation to write the book, was there something in the family or a friend, or in other words, I assume you would have had to do some extensive research on not only that period of time when the earlier part of the book when she contracted the disease.
Right.
And tell us a little bit about that in terms of familiarizing yourself to be comfortable writing about someone who's using an iron lung to sustain life.
Yeah, I mean, it was also something that I, of course, had heard about, but never really saw one of these machines. And I think the term is so misleading because you picture some kind of medieval torture device that looks like iron, and it really was more of a sort of a stainless steel capsule. It looks like a little space capsule almost, with basically just your head emerging from the end of it, with kind of a collar around it to seal, so that the device would actually press down on your lungs and then release, so that your lungs would expand and contract. So the person could actually breathe on their own, but the lung was doing the motion of what we all just take for granted, which is just,
and
normal
an item
breathing.
like this ran solely on electrical power.
Right,
Okay.
right, yeah.
So you can understand that, obviously if there's any kind of power outages, again, and this is going back, I don't know, when were iron lungs first developed? Any idea?
There was really kind of a short window. I mean, this was something I learned doing this research, but prior to, I think it was developed really in maybe the 30s or 40s. Okay. So really there was a short window where they were used, because prior to that you would die if you contracted polio and you couldn't breathe, if it affected your body in the way that this person was affected, you would die. But once the lungs were developed, in every year people contracted polio. It became sort of a summer thing where kids were kept inside sometimes if there was an outbreak in a town. There was a big scare, and because they really didn't understand how it was transmitted from person to person. So what I learned was that during that time span, there were hospitals that had wards of these lungs, just 20, 30 in a row, and people in each one. I just try to imagine what that would be like, and I've seen pictures of it, because now of course you can go online and Google iron lung and get a lot of information about what that time period would have been like. But then after the vaccine was introduced, very quickly iron lungs sort of became obsolete, except for these very few people who, for whatever reason, could not use a portable respirator, right, because a lot of people were able to get out of the iron lung, either recovered some of their muscle function, or were just able to use that portable respirator. But this particular woman was not able to do that.
Right.
Yeah.
And one other thing, and then we'll get back to the book. In the case of a family friend of ours, a dear friend of ours, again, a survivor of polio. Again, she has the braces and uses crutches.
Right.
And just a quick story, over the most recent holidays, we were down in Florida, and all of a sudden a gentleman, at one point, she joined us for a couple of days at the hotel where we were staying on our way back to Florida, and someone said, oh, next year will be a better year, no doubt, because he saw her on crutches. And again, as I said earlier, this was a thing where a lot of people have no concept of what polio is. Obviously,
right. Yeah.
In our case, we were born after the vaccine, but it was still that thing, well, you got to get your vaccine. I can remember in grammar school, anybody who doesn't have the vaccine, you probably wouldn't even be allowed in school.
Right.
But this gentleman, who was probably thinking she might have a broken leg or two, was trying to be kind and say, the new year will be better for you. And she goes, and she just kind of joked, I've been living this way for like 6 decades,
Right.
And again, as in Vivian, the lifespan obviously, is quite lengthy.
It can be.
Or the woman that was in the true story down in the Carolinas. So.
Right.
We're here with Susan Schoenberger, author of The Virtues of Oxygen. Talk a little bit about, again, there's kind of an interesting kind of play going. You've got, Vivian, who of course is dependent on so many others, and then you have another character who's Holly, who's in the newspaper business herself, and a widow with a couple of kids. Talk a little bit about how those two kind of form an allegiance.
Right. So Holly is, as you said, a woman who edits a local newspaper, and she is a young widow. She's in her early 40s and has two boys who are, school age, in high school and middle school. And, she's caught in this very tough situation because her husband dies unexpectedly. She's sort of left to fend for herself. And she grew up in the same town where she lives, and she actually grew up in a fairly well-to-do family. So it's just that sense of coming down in the world, which I think a lot of people have experienced in this decade that we've just lived through. So I was trying to sort of capture the idea of those stories that we've all read in the paper over the last, I don't know, since the recession started, about people who have kind of lost everything. And you read a 2,000-word story in a magazine or a newspaper, and you just really don't get the sense of what will happen to this person, and how will they recover, and will they be able to find a job, and what will happen to their family. And so I was trying to sort of recreate that in a novel form, kind of tell the story of one fictional character that encapsulated that whole idea of what we've all lived through. And even if people didn't lose their jobs in the recession, or managed to do pretty well or stay afloat, let's just say, we all knew people who did, and we also all feared that would be us. I mean, I think it was so hard to read those stories and know that all of our jobs felt, I think, insecure, and still kind of do. So it somewhat was an effort to capture that, but also to put these two characters together so that I could kind of show a little bit of that small town dynamic about how people help each other and get to know each other's quirks and accept that in a way that maybe it doesn't always happen if you live in a big city and people don't really always know who you are and what you're really about. So that's kind of, I really, the book works in a way that the first person story of Vivian, who starts out telling her tale of getting polio, and kind of how she had to adjust to that as a very young person. Her story is told in the first person, and then Holly's story is told, they're not really chapter by chapter, but they go back and forth, and her story is told in the third person.
Which is a good way, because as you read the book, you get the feeling that, again, in order to kind of understand where they are or where Holly is in her situation, and in Vivian, you kind of have to, jump back and forth.
Right.
Otherwise, Holly wouldn't show up until chapter 40.
Yeah. So it jumps back and forth in time a little bit too, but I think it's pretty easy to understand. It's not a confusing.
Talk about where you grew up. Now, you're a native of Newburgh, New York.
Yes.
And the book is set in a fictionalized town in New York, if I'm correct. Tell us a little bit about where you grew up, and kind of are we to derive some of the small town feeling is kind of like what you felt. I mean, I haven't spent a lot of time in Newburgh, but I know it's it's kind of a quiet area. It's a city, but it's but it's surrounded by a lot of countryside.
Yeah, it's Newburgh is an interesting place. It's a small city, very small. I think it's about 30,000 people. So we call West Hartford a town, but it's double the size of the city of Newburgh. And I lived in a town called New Windsor, which is right next to Newburgh, and really it's called, everyone sort of refers to it as Newburgh. But I lived in a neighborhood where my parents, we were all in and out of each other's houses, and sort of had that small town feel to it. And then this town that I create in the book, Bertram Corners, I kind of just picture it as maybe certainly further upstate. Newburgh's only maybe an hour from New York City, but a little bit further, and a little off in the countryside, maybe one of the towns that we would drive through when we were...
Almost like a Schenectady, maybe.
Right, or even smaller than that. It was just a town that didn't have a lot of industry, but had its own little main street with businesses that was struggling because of malls and then outlet malls that made the malls,
there's many
suffer.
cities. I can think of my hometown of Bridgeport that is very much like that. There's a mall, and even the mall we had wound up like getting bulldozed.
Exactly.
So it's kind of like
that cycle, and the next thing is always going to sort of threaten the thing before it that threatened the thing before that.
Exactly.
So it's really it's just such a typical American story. Any of these small towns, or you could extrapolate to a bigger city even. But I like the idea of setting these characters in a place where people really knew each other's ins and outs, and Vivian, who's in the Iron Lung, kind of becomes the hub of gossip and exchange of information in the town, because everyone's sort of going in and out of her house in order to volunteer to sit with her, because she can't be left alone.
Exactly, for not even a moment.
Right. So she has this amazing network of people, and you think, well, would that even happen in a place that didn't make that connection with this person? She probably would have had to hire people, or there would have to be, the state would somehow be involved. But in her case, she was able to have this tight-knit group around her. So I just like that idea, that dynamic, and as soon as I thought about how I was going to develop the story, that setting really came to me.
There you go. Susan Schoenberger joining us here on Studio 411, the book, The Virtues of Oxygen. In the book you hear about Vivian's life, as we talked earlier, and a lot of it is through a series of unaired podcasts. Now, in other words, these were things that were created or taped. Again, I don't have a podcast, but I understand the concept. And then in reality, the masses did not see them, only those close to her, correct?
Right.
And then, but through those podcasts, the reader gets an idea of not only what has transpired and then what is going through her head, as opposed to her verbalizing it to Holly or one of the other characters. How did that concept come to you in writing the book? Obviously, as someone that is, works in media, communications director, by the way, at Hartford Seminary, I was just curious how that came about, to use that concept and to tell her story.
Right. Well, I think I was trying to figure out how she would technically be able to tell her story. She does sort of adopt. She's an early adopter of the internet and doing things by voice on computer. But of course, that's not terribly accurate still. So I thought, well, if she could record these pieces of her history, because she also does have a podcast where she talks about independent movies, and it's a way for her to reach lots of people and get and be the equal to everyone else. So the people hearing her podcast anywhere in the world would have no idea that she's in this iron lung.
So she had the podcast, but it was basically to talk about things not necessarily related to her immediate life. And that's why
so she records these pieces of her life in order to maybe explain a little bit more about her story after she's gone. I think she knows
like
that.
A viral time capsule, basically, for those. Cause,
exactly. I think, if she had well, I don't want to give too much away.
I hear you.
Yeah.
Another character, again, that was only in briefly, but I don't know, it struck a chord with me, was with Timmy Gallagher, again, Vivian's former school friend.
Right.
There was a scene where, again, this was kind of one of those harking back to the 50s when, the TVs were first around and they were watching, I believe, a thing of Elvis on the Ed Sullivan Show, whatever. And of course, as many of us have stories from our parents or aunts and uncles, whatever, about, people would literally, gather. All of a sudden you had all the friends in the world, because this one had the first color TV or this one had the first black and white. And that kind of struck a chord with me of stories that I had heard, growing up, not quite in the 50s, but throughout the 60s and even early 70s. But this Timmy Gallagher, what troubled me, and I know he came back later on in the book briefly, but you know, he was there, and then was it such a traumatic thing? I got the impression, not for him, but for the parent or parents, that basically, you know, you're not going over there again. Kind of like our own parents would say, oh, no, you know, don't play with that kid anymore, for whatever reason, be it ethnicity, be it, you know, whatever, gender, or be it social status. Was that kind of like where that particular thing was going?
I mean, I think there was that fear that the parents had, that, you know, that could be me. That could be me stuck in this house taking care of a child in an iron lung.
Or I even thought maybe that it would be the fear with even with other ailments or diseases that, oh, don't get too close, you might get it.
Right.
That mentality.
And they wouldn't have really understood then that the disease wouldn't be contagious at that point. But I think in writing that scene where the mother basically takes this young boy who's come over to say hello to his friend and kind of steers him out the door and doesn't really allow him to come back. I think, you know, she's also trying to avoid interaction at all with this family and with this needy child, because you're talking about a child who, you know, has a brain that hasn't been impaired but can't really do anything, so needs like constant attention and entertainment. And I think this mother just kind of didn't want to be involved with, you know, being part of that.
I think, not just because you wrote it that way, but I think we all can relate to at some point, not because of a physical ailment or whatever, but somebody that, again, for many reasons, you know, it could be a prejudice situation, could be whatever, a social class issue where, you know, this kind of, you know, discourages it. And again, a child at that age, sometimes even older, doesn't fully comprehend, and maybe never does, you know, unless it's
and it's heartbreaking because she connected with this boy and would have loved to have at least spent some time with him. So,
like I said, that struck a chord with me. I don't know why, but again, it's you know, it's good stuff. Who have been your inspirations from a literary standpoint? Obviously, I know you've been a newspaper columnist, writer, etc. So it's not like you just picked this up, you know, at age 29 and said, let me just, you know, start writing books here, you know. So tell us a little bit about not only people that inspired you, some maybe not even authors, but that kind of got you to where you are today as far as writing books.
Sure. Well, when I graduated from college, I went right into the newspaper business. I had my first job in Torrington, Connecticut at the Register-Citizen, and spent some time oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Okay. So I have worked at lots of different newspapers, and spent about 7 years at the Baltimore Sun, and then about 12 years at the Hartford Courant, and left there in 2008 when they kind of really reduced the size of the staff.
That's a story for another book.
Yes, exactly. So
although it is in the book.
Right, there are those themes of kind of the contraction of journalism and what that means, you know, what that means for society and what that means for journalists, and that's definitely all in the book there. But sort of along the way, I just decided that I sort of always wanted to write fiction, but just never really tackled it. And, you know, you get busy, you're working. I have 3 kids, and so just along the way, I came up with an idea for a novel and wrote the entire thing. You know, this was probably about 15 plus years ago, and that one is the one that will never see the light of day, you know, the practice novel that's in a drawer somewhere. But I was just inspired, I think, a lot by, honestly, people that I worked with at different newspapers who were getting things published and writing short stories, and, you know, I was always surrounded by people who were doing lots of different kinds of writing. And the way that I prefer journalism is actually to be very straightforward, very not embellished at all, and then you don't have that outlet to sort of play with words and write sentences that are really beautiful and interesting, and you know, hopefully make people think in a different way. So I just really wanted that outlet, and I started to, you know, spend some time, once my kids were all in school, spend some time working, you know, a few hours a day on short stories and eventually novels. And it sort of built from there. I mean, I love, there's so many writers that I love who are working today. Ann Patchett is a big favorite of mine. Richard Ford, whose work I think is just remarkable. And, you know, I mean, I could name like probably 20 people whose work I just love. So, you know, I had those books around me, and to be honest, I never found the time to go back and get an MFA or take a lot of writing courses beyond, you know, kind of just my own work. So I really studied those books in order to kind of give myself a little, you know, my own little private MFA. I really looked to the books that I loved, and I kind of deconstructed them and said, you know, how did they piece this story together, and how did they do it scene by scene and chapter by chapter? So that's kind of you know, how it developed.
Yeah, good. And I've said this before on the program, the pedigree, if I'm using the right word, of people you worked with in your time, especially in the Hartford area. I mean, we've had like Bob Engelhardt here, who, you know, Bob is a editorial cartoonist, and even he wrote a book, you know, and of course, you know, his love of short track racing, and along with his memoir. One of your photojournalists who has been a guest on the show, Mark-Eve Regis, same thing, combining his talent with photojournalism. So again, it's quite a, near future we're going to have Susan Campbell on. So, you know, you just, you know, I'm very fortunate to be able to draw from all you people. And again, just the fact that then you're taking what I think is the next step up in terms of getting published, that's a big deal. You know, I mean, it's great what you did before, and obviously I'm sure you'll continue to contribute in, you know, in that way as well, besides just the literary work as well. Do you make yourself little notes about ideas, things that, like I took a look at it, didn't bring any examples, but your Twitter page, where I noticed, you know, and maybe people do this a lot, I don't use Twitter, but where all of a sudden they'll write something, or something that maybe, you know, ticks them off, or sometimes little kind of subtle thoughts, and I thought, I wonder if, you know, these things are like, goes back and say, hey, you know, I'm going to use that in a chapter someday. I mean, how do you, you know, kind of...
I'm glad you looked at my Twitter page, because I feel like no one looks at my Twitter page, so...
And I don't have a Twitter account. I just said, well, doing my research, and I just thought it was great, you know, it just, you know, some people use it for different things, whatever. I just thought, it's kind of like, you know, she's throwing things out and seeing what sticks.
Random thoughts, and you know, you try to be a little funny and entertaining, because otherwise no one really looks at your Twitter page. But yeah, it's often like, you know, little things that annoy you, or little pieces of insight that you think you might have, and I don't technically write them down. I'm terrible at journaling or keeping those kinds of notes. I'm really more of a, I put everything on the manuscript document as I'm thinking about it, and I'm not even very...
Oh, so what happens if you're you know, in the produce aisle, and you come up with a thought? What happens
well,
then?
Once in a while,
I will call your house phone and say, okay, leave a voicemail on my entering machine.
I used to have, you know, scraps of paper or the backs of a receipt, and I would be in the car, and something would come to me, and I'd be at a red light, and I'd be scratching it on the back of a receipt. But now I really, I can either record it on my iPhone, or I can use the notes function. Or I just try to remember it.
Not while she's driving.
Not while I'm driving. Never while I'm driving.
See, I being more old school, said every year I'm going to get myself a notebook. So I get this little notebook, and then what happens? I lose the notebook. So, you know, I don't know. I don't think there's any hope. It's either up here, and once this starts to go, then I'm in trouble.
Well, usually, I mean, between being at work or being at home, I'm not that far away from my laptop or my desktop, so I usually have enough time to get back before the thought goes away.
Good deal. Susan Schoenberger joining us for the hour here on Studio 411. Her book, The Virtues of Oxygen. And let's get back a little to the book. Another point in the book that again kind of reminded me of some things growing up was Holly has the character that interacts with Vivian, the widow working at the local paper, has two boys, a lot of money issues, potential, foreclosure in the cards, again, set during the Great Recession of the last decade, and some would say even continuing into more recent years as well. I recall at one point, kind of like Vivian in one sense and kind of like Holly. I remember a situation where my parents, one was out of work for a long period of time, the recession of what they call the Great Recession of the mid-'70s. But the thing was, as a kid, and I was probably already in high school, they never kind of made you feel like there was trouble brewing, okay? And one thing too different was that, the house was already paid for. And I think that's a big thing.
Right.
When you start having things where mortgage payments are late and all sorts of other bills are kind of starting to slip by the wayside. Do you feel that, again, the children in the book kind of were shielded, or kind of, or did they kind of have an understanding that, mom is stressing out here?
I think she tries to shield them as much as possible. And of course, at the beginning of the story, she's really being helped by her mom, who then suffers a stroke and is not writing the extra checks anymore. So that, things just have snowballed to the point where, she's in very bad situation. And the boys who are 13 and 16, about that age in the book, I think that they do sense it, and there is the one scene where they kind of go out into the woods and cut down a Christmas tree, because they know that she's struggling, and that would be even a difficult thing for her to. I came away. They understand to a point, but at the same time, I guess. Being youthful or thinking young, even at any age, sometimes you either block things out or you're not fully conscious of the severity of a situation. Right. And I think they're like most kids. Money is sort of an abstract concept for them. I mean, they know that you get a salary and they know that you pay for things, but they're not really involved in, the writing of the bills or the balancing of the checkbook. So to them, it's just like, come on, why, if you can pay for this, why can't you pay for that?
Especially in this day. No iPod, what's going on here? We'd be lucky with a, what do you call it? What was that called? The, Give a Show projector. Remember that?
That one.
That's before her time. Etch-a-Sketch. Let's go with that.
Yeah.
Vivian, on the other hand, with all her physical ailments, is the opposite. She wishes she could get out into the world more, but she's left pretty well provided even after her parents, come and go.
Right.
And it's kind of like, a balancing act. One is, worrying about where we're, and mentally and physically becoming ill in the sense of, stressing out about the situation. The other one has got stresses as well, just because of the situation she's been in. But she's actually kind of, has not just self-educated, gets educated, gets a degree, and actually, I think, doesn't give herself enough credit for all that she achieves, which, again, going back to our friend that I mentioned earlier that had polio as a child, the parents, from what she told me, never coddled her and always said, you can be whatever you want to be. And I think that's important in any young child, regardless of whether there's impairments or physical situations or not. And she wound up, again, master's degree, educator for 40 years. So there's something to be said about. So being shielded sometimes in subtle ways is good, I think. Ever get writer's block?
Not so far.
Okay.
Let me just knock there.
After this show, she'll be, it's all your fault.
No. I mean, I think because I don't have tons of time to write, to be honest, I write when I'm not working, so on the weekends and sometimes at night and sometimes before work. so I feel like the ideas kind of build up, and I'm really thinking about the characters even when I'm not actively writing. So, you know, sometimes people will ask me, well, how do you find the time to put a book together? And you know, I realize that I may be loading the dishwasher, I may be doing laundry, I may be going for a run, and there's this little script in my head, you know, where I'm sort of tinkering with ideas or tinkering with character development or trying to think about what the next scene would be. For the book that I'm writing now, you know, I'm kind of maybe 2/3 of the way through a first draft, so I'm still in that process of creating the story and building it. So you know, it's kind of a wonderful thing to have your brain doing the work. I think it does that work at night, you know, when you're sleeping. You wake up in the morning and you have an idea. So often those times when you're not really actively thinking about it is sometimes the best sort of creative times.
I found that even in my talks with Bob Engelhardt, some of his best drawing and thought process about what he's going to editorialize about within his artwork is usually in the morning, or I'll check, for instance, email or, you know, the social media accounts and people that I interact with, whatever. Now you'll be one, you'll be, look at her, it's 4 a.m. and she's, you know, I'm trying to take a hot shower and she's already, like, you know, tweeting things and doing stuff on Facebook. But it's true, it's the old adage, you know, sometimes, you know, get a quick start, but also in fairness, because again, you're not actively in the newspaper business, you have deadlines, but they're of a different type now. Whereas with newspapers, you know, and whether they're online or the traditional paper ones, there's a lot more, you know, angst, you know, where am I going to, or even television news. I mean, you know, people up at 3 o'clock in the morning because report here, go there. So, you know, yours is a good thing.
I'm not sorry to be away from that right now,
and I've gotten that impression from several that you know, I've talked with. And again, I've even broached a few people about, you know, doing a show about that. And sometimes I think folks, you know, they don't want to burn any bridges, so they're a little hesitant. But I get the, you know, the running theme throughout that. And it's, you know, hey, as long as you move on to bigger and better things. Advice for aspiring writers. You were once one. What would you, in 30 seconds or less?
Oh, 30 seconds or less. I would say, I mean, the obvious ones are read as much as you possibly can. Take writing classes if you can do that, because the basics are often what people sort of forget when they're starting out. You know, just read and study those books the way I mentioned before. You know, you have to look at it with a writer's eye and not a reader's eye. So you might go back and read your favorite book and just dissect it and say, how did the author actually accomplish what, you know, I loved about this book? So those are some ideas. I mean, there's so many resources now online and writers groups, and if you're lucky enough to have a critique group, that's a great way to do it too.
Did I misunderstand? You teach writing as well?
I do teach writing. I teach some classes at the Mark Twain House, which is a phenomenal resource for writers. So I'm teaching a 6-week fiction class starting in May this year. So it's like once a week for 2 hours, 6 weeks, and I think this will be the 4th time that I've taught that class. And once in a while I do sort of an afternoon workshop on things like how to find an agent, or, you know, how to build your idea. So lots of other great writers teach there as well. So it's not just fiction, obviously. They do poetry and memoir and nonfiction and all kinds of stuff.
So it's a great resource and outlet to check into. Another theme, as I read the book, to me anyway, was how each generation struggles to equal or surpass what their parents had and provided for. And I know that's been something that I can attest to in my life, and that I miss. Again, the beauty about a fiction book is that I'm sure people come up to you and said, oh, you know, this book reminds me of this, that, and you're like saying, well, I don't know, but everybody draws their own.
Exactly. Everyone brings their own personal story to the story that you've written, and it's so interesting the way that people describe the characters, you know, when they're discussing it with me, and sometimes they attribute, you know, motives and things like that that I wouldn't necessarily have been thinking about, but it kind of also makes sense to me when they put it out there. It could be subconscious, and it could just be, well, my thinking doesn't line up with your thinking, but that doesn't mean you don't get something, you know, just as valuable out of the book.
But I think that's what makes a great fiction book, because again, it is fiction, and even though it may be drawn on certain things in your life or your experiences, weaved in with some, you know, names and places that might be actual, you know, places, but still, you know, people, I'm trying to think of one offhand where people like analyze, you know, 100, 200 years later, and they're still analyzing a book, trying, oh no, he or she meant that, or he or she meant this, and it'll never, you know, you might as well say, you know, who killed Kennedy or somebody, you know, we assume we know, but then if somebody always throws a monkey wrench, says, well, no, what about this, what about that? So it's the same thing in a fiction book. It's someone will say, no, that's not what he or she meant.
And sometimes the author doesn't know, or sometimes the author can't really tell you where that idea came from. And it's funny because my siblings, I have a brother and two sisters, and at least with my first book, they, you know, I told some story or made some reference in the book, and they remembered it as something that happened when we were kids that I consciously really didn't remember, but obviously it was there because it came out in one of the characters. So that's, you know, that's part of it too. It's like all sort of mixed up in the way that your brain works and builds a story.
Another poignant, if not small moment in the book was where Vivian meets another iron lung person, and I believe actually struck up a communication via the internet or somehow, and then met this person. But this person, I guess, I don't know, maybe jaded her a little bit, because it didn't seem as upbeat about life as she was.
Right.
You know?
Well, I think this happens, if I'm remembering my own book correctly, happens when they're both maybe in their early 30s, and I think they write letters back and forth. She sees something about him on a television show, and they realize that they're both approximately the same age, and they sort of have this short correspondence, and then physically meet in a hospital. And then, yes, he's not in a happy place. But of course, during the course of her life, she's in and out of those experiences as well, because, you know, if you can even imagine what it would be like to grow up essentially in an iron lung. It happens to her when she's 6, and when you're 6, you know, you have a completely different view of life and what it may or may not be like. I think you live very much more in the moment, and then as she goes through her teenage years, it's, you know, devastating, because she starts to really understand what's happening.
There's, to play off that point, there is a line in here from Vivian, quote, "I would have given every penny I ever had to spend a single day outside my iron lung." So again, and also in terms of, like, at that age, as 5, 6, 7 years old, at least where you have some recollection or can, you know, form opinions or memories. Look how many people, famous and not famous, that, for instance, maybe lost their sight, but then, you know, then have recollection of seeing, but then, you know, then it's gone. And then, you know, at least in that case, I mean, they can, you know, it's not something I would want to experience, but at least the other senses kick in this case, you know, and again, just not to beat a dead horse with this, but again, with the iron lung, if I understood correctly, she has no use of arms or legs.
Right.
You see what I'm saying? So it's just like, you know, it's like just a head, you know, and it's amazing. You know, and this is, it's fiction, but in the case of the actual apparatus and the experience, it's very real.
Exactly.
You know, you know, powerful stuff. There's something in here, and it might have even mentioned the gentleman in the book. And again, I'm just saying it as my my kind of observation. The book, in terms of the characters and the small town, kind of folksiness, reminded me a lot of like a Frank Capra, It's a Wonderful Life. I'm not trying to like say, oh, we're going to compare the two. It's just an observation.
Sure,
I just thought it was,
not a bad thing.
I think, it's certainly, we should all be like,
That's a classic.
Exactly. Something that actually was not very well thought of when it first came out, but then has become like, this endearing classic. So, we should only be so lucky with that. But really, that you capture that well, and you talked earlier about kind of the area where you grew up in New York. So I think a lot more of that shines through than maybe you realize maybe later on. Or again, what are some of the feedback you've gotten from people at a lot of the book signings?
It's been great to see online a lot of. I mean, I have had some signings and some library talks and things like that. But this one, I've gotten a lot of emails from people and just comments on customer reviews online, and people talk about. Well, I've had polio survivors contact me and say, this was my experience, and this is just so interesting to read about, or someone who grew up next door to someone who had been in an iron lung for 30 or 40 years and sort of was, confirming what those experiences were like.
It's, that's great that, because again, as we said earlier, a lot of people don't realize, because there are so few people that are or have been afflicted with that disease. The ones that are not even in this continent, it's other parts where again the vaccines are just not getting there, or there's a resurgence of it for some reason. So again, you've touched on something that I don't ever recall if I ever saw a movie or a television show or even a book about where it deals with this subject matter. So
so it's a little, even though it's a contemporary book, there's sort of that element of historical fiction in a way, because it tries to address something that happened really quite a long time ago.
There was a quote here, and now I can't locate it. It was something about the state of the print media, and I was fascinated how you worked that in. But again, it is in a kind of a state of flux. I think my whatever handicap is at being older than obviously the younger generation. I like reading a story that goes into more in depth. I think now we have things with not social media, but what is perceived as like news that is basically you don't know whether the facts have been checked. It's like the old New York Times thing about the the news being fit to print or whatever. And now it's just like let's throw it up on the wall and see how much of it sticks. And I think that's a shame. So it is great that there are small papers. Some are just, like what we call, the local rag. Others, again, I think and it can be online, but it's the ones that, that have no track record, and you're like supposed to, put all my faith in what they're saying is true. Not just about, oh, this one got a ticket or that this bank got robbed, but the story behind the story, and that's what I think we're missing out on. So. Real quickly, you talked about the publishing business. Talk about some of the intricacies as you began your fictional writing career about the publishing business.
It's a challenging time to be getting books published, and it's been kind of a long haul, but very interesting process to go through. I had to really learn all about it from scratch. It took me about a year to get an agent when I was first writing, and had my first novel I was trying to get that published. So that was a big uphill battle to begin with. But if you want to be published in through a traditional publisher, you really do need to have an agent. So I really knew that was like the big hurdle. If I could get an agent, then I probably had a decent chance of getting published. So the first book, it took me it took my agent about 2 years to sell it, because she was also trying to sell it in that period of time, like 2007, 2008, when publishers were also not buying very many books because of what was happening with the economy.
Right.
And there's been so many changes in that industry, you know, publishers consolidating and different things happening. So I've been really fortunate, because, you know, it's even more difficult to sell a second novel than it is to sell a first. Usually you have a track record, so they can look at your sales and see whether or not, you know, you've done okay.
Oh, okay.
So I've been lucky enough to, you know, land with a good publisher and be able to get the word out. But it's always a challenge, because the marketplace is absolutely flooded with books right now, both by smaller publishers and traditional publishers, and by people who are self-publishing. And I give anyone who self-publishes a ton of credit, because it's really still just as difficult as publishing through traditional means. It's just that you have to go about it on your own. And so it's, yeah.
I think I've known a couple that are doing self-publishing, and
Yeah.
again, I think that's, as you said, a major hurdle. But I think the one that I like is that I think the ones that these smaller, you know, publishing houses, I think those are the ones where I find, even in researching, you know, books that, or authors that interest me to have on the program, I find that not only from the standpoint of working with them, but also you know, bringing it to the forefront. I think, you know, I've enjoy, you know, dealing with the smaller houses, and I think that sometimes they do a better job. I don't know. I think sometimes you get lost in the, you know, the big conglomerate.
Right.
I think you get lost in the whole process. You know.
Right. There's very much of a hierarchy in publishing.
Yeah.
So if you're somebody selling tons and tons of books, you're much more likely to get a lot of attention from all aspects of it.
Susan, forgive me. Susan, I better have another drink of water here. Susan Schoenberger, The Virtues of Oxygen, joining us here on Studio 411 for the hour. And I'll hold up your other book there, if we can get a shot of that. That's the first book, A Watershed Year. And Susan and I were talking about it just real quick in the remaining time we have. There was that image that was used for the book. Where were you, in Europe or Ireland when that happened?
It was actually not this image. It was the image that was on the original cover of the book, which shows it's a similar image with a woman and a young boy, but they're walking through kind of a forest, and they walking also facing away from the camera, which is very much a women's fiction trope these days. But they were walking through this forest, and there's sort of orange tones to it. And as we were vacationing in Ireland, my son was studying in college there, and my daughter happened to notice a billboard that had the exact same image on it, because obviously it was a stock photo that was used.
There you go.
So you never know where how publishers come up with these covers, because the authors really don't have very much to say about it. But she pointed it out. She yelled, "Mom, that's your book cover!" And we turned around and took some pictures in front of it. And
as long as you didn't hijack. Susan, thank you for being with us. We look forward to the next book, and we will look for that in the coming year, I hope. And
probably a little further along,
well,
but yeah.
You heard it here. She'll be back with us again. The book again, The Virtues of Oxygen. I think I need oxygen, folks. Susan Schoenberger joining us here on Studio 411. We appreciate you joining us for the hour, and we look forward to seeing you here again next time on Studio 411. Have a great day.